All right. Welcome to another episode of the Stairway to Seven podcast, where we talk about all things, entrepreneurship, mindset, financial literacy, and the Stairway to Seven because there's no elevator to success. You got to take the stairs. And importantly, six figures ain't what it used to be. So we need to change the conversation and focus on making seven figures. And with that, today we have a very special guest, a person who has personally inspired me. As a matter of fact, you don't know this, Rakim, but you're the reason I got certified as a CFEI. I didn't tell you that before, but now you know. All right, so we have Rakim Sabree. He is a TED Talk speaker, not TEDx, TED Talk, published author, contributing author, media celebrity. What else did I miss?
I think you covered them. I think you covered most of it.
All right. So this is very exciting for me. Because so far in the podcast that, this is a new podcast. So to have somebody of your renown on, number one, is exciting for me. But importantly, I think our audience is going to benefit because as I've been talking about mindset in our previous podcast episodes, one thing that I started to talk about, just to kind of plant the seed, was the idea of financial trauma. And this is something that I've only learned from you, and I've heard like one other person talk about, but as we try to peel back the layers to look at why we're in the places that we're in, it makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, this is information that we hadn't had before. So this is really important for us. Now, before we get into the weeds, people may not know you, right? So there might be people who are heavy in social media, but in different spaces. So they may not know your story. How do you typically introduce yourself to people who may not know who you are, what you do?
Good question. I find that I have to constantly remind myself that people have jumped on this train, right, at different points in time, right? So when I first started in like the public space, I guess, and social media and such, my focus was just strictly mentorship, not even financial literacy. And then I pivoted into financial literacy or financial education and talking about the importance of and just really regurgitating a lot of the stuff that was already out there. Then I pivoted into financial empowerment. I thought that was a little bit more niche, a little bit more specific. And I found that big brands, big organizations were interchanging the terms financial empowerment and financial literacy. And I'm like, well, that's not it. And then, of course, as you mentioned, I landed on financial trauma where I focus now. So I think it really depends on the audience, but I introduce myself as an author, columnist, speaker, and financial coach. I think that really just kind of covers all the different aspects of the work that I do and the work that I have been doing.
Okay, I like that. Now, for many of us, you went viral, or we came to know about you when you went viral for quitting your job, and you talked about like the struggles of workplace culture and toxicity and how it affects mental health. But again, still, we may have people who don't know the story. If you wouldn't mind just kind of recounting that story so that we can really understand how that shift in your life took place, so that you're in the space that you're in now, so that when you're speaking to different topics, they understand that it's not just something that's theoretical, but something that you lived and overcome, and then we're able to make a pivot.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but just to kind of summarize, so I spent 10 years in the banking industry. I started at 21 as a part-time teller, and I was customer facing for about 6 years, pretty much doing everything in the branch environment. The last 4 years of my banking career, I was back office support in operations discipline. So I managed programs. My title was program manager. In May of 2021 was when I had gotten to a point where I was like, you know what, I want to do this solo thing, right? And there's different ways that I articulate that story, but I think the most important aspects of that story for me to share definitely surround mental health and the impact of mental health on Black men in particular, but Black people in general in a corporate environment, in the way that we have to learn how to be other than ourselves and that we have to learn how to navigate the political atmosphere in order to really just get by. But if we have any aspirations on what growth looks like to succeed. So I had been playing that game for a decade. And when I started picking up steam in my own personal endeavors outside of the corporate environment, and I learned that I don't need the validation of my supervisor or my supervisor, and that there was really no cap or no limit with regard to time on when I could produce the things that I was producing, whether that be, writing a book or writing for publications or going after certifications. If I could take ownership of that growth on my own, then there was really no limit to what I could accomplish. And so that I was very content at the time to do both. I needed to make money. I needed, to take care of myself, pay my bills, and I didn't have the confidence, I would say. Actually, let me retract that statement. It wasn't really an issue of confidence as much as it was an issue of I had drank the Kool-Aid. I was bought into this idea that in order to survive financially, I needed to have a job. And it was a combination of frustration and just the culmination of all of what I had shared, right? The microaggressions, the passive aggressive behavior, the limiting behavior, right? Keeping me on a leash and saying, hey, you can only go this far, but you have to do this thing first, the dangling of the carrot. And then the attacks to my person, right? The attacks to who I am and how I show up. I said, you know what? I have something to go to. I've been building a brand. I'm an author, right? I'm a speaker, and not just an author, not just a speaker, but to your point, like I've delivered a TED talk. My book was best selling. I'm writing for these publications, and so understanding the gravity of my accomplishments was a big part of building the confidence needed to recognize that there's opportunity for me to make money outside of that environment. And so after I took inventory of what it is that I had accumulated by way of assets, what it is that I've accumulated by way of connections, what it is that I've accumulated by way of skill set, I said, you know what, I could do this on my own. And so I made the decision to leave.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned an important point, and that was that in these environments, we have to effectively suppress some or part of who we are in order to gain validation and acceptance and to have an theoretically unimpeded career trajectory. And I found that myself. So, for example, I'm a fairly large guy, like I'm 6'5", 3 bills. And I find myself like physically shrinking in front of people so that they don't feel intimidated. So, and there was a point when I worked in a bank centuries ago. I worked at Nations Bank, and it was a bad deal. I had applied for the management program. They flatly denied me and hired people that not only were less qualified. So, for example, they hired this woman who was a high school graduate. She had done no education after high school and had worked in a department store prior to joining the bank as a teller. They put her in the program. So it's like, okay, I can see where this is not going to end up, you know? And then as I tried to find answers, all the responses were pretty vague. And there was never anything that was concrete. But what I took away from it was, you're not exactly the representation that we want for the bank, you know? So as you talk about that, what does that do to you to know that, like you said, you can't show up as who you are, with your full self, and expect to be valued? How does that impact you?
I think that's a good question. And I would reframe just kind of the thought process there, because I imagine there are a lot of people like me, well, not like me, but a lot of people that look like me, whose experiences will run parallel, and that they would disagree that they couldn't be themselves. And so what happens effectively in these environments is that we change ourselves, right? So we're being ourselves in these environments, but ourselves as we show up is a different version than who we are at home.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is that you forget who your actual self is because you spend so much time in that environment, right? So I talk about my time in corporate. I started at 21 and left at 31. So all of my 20s, pretty much, I spent in that space. And during that time period where most people are getting to know themselves and deciding who they want to be, permanently as a person, I was influenced by cultural norms, corporate cultural norms that says I have to show up a certain way, I have to dress a certain way, I have to talk a certain way. And so to your point, shrinking in the presence of other people is to some extent expected. And if you challenge that, or if you come off as threatening, then your push right into the the front of the ranks as far as what opportunities look like become limited. So how do you change how you show up to show a non-threatening version of yourself? How do you change your pitch and tone when you speak?
Mhm.
Do you make eye contact, right? And then how do you straddle that line of coming off as confident but not cocky or not arrogant, right? And so there's a lot to be said there, I think, around perception. And one of the phrases rather they toss around quite a lot in the corporate environments is, well, perception is reality.
Mhm.
But perception is whose reality is
Right.
the question asked, right?
Right.
And so who controls that reality then becomes the bigger question. And as a man, and the way that I was raised as a man, I was always taught that a man controls his environment, right? And so then that, another layer to pull back says, well, in those environments, are we allowed to be men? And when I say we, I mean Black men. Are we allowed to be men in those spaces? And I get a lot of pushback when I talk about the Black man experience in these spaces because there are Black women who experience microaggressions and the systemic inequalities that impact both groups. And so then you have to go down the rabbit hole of intersectionality and women are not paid at the same rate as men are, but then Black women on top of that have their set of issues that are very different than ours. And so my rebuttal usually is that, well, I can only speak from the experience that I have, right? I don't have the Black woman experience, I have the Black man experience. And so I think that those problems certainly need to be acknowledged. But talking in terms of my experience, maturing into a man, certainly in my 30s, is a very different experience than what maturing through my 20s looked like. And oftentimes in those environments, my direct leadership were middle-aged white women who you had to kind of dance around again this idea of, are you threatening?
Mhm.
Are you intimidating? Do they feel the need, when often is the case that they do, to to have these power plays, right? To show that they are more powerful than you. And that was my experience, unfortunately, towards the end of my career. But I say that kind of tongue in cheek because the fortunate part of that is that it landed me where I am today.
Okay. So I would think that, especially given the impact that you point out on your mental health, that somehow there has to be um, a related impact on, or a broader impact on trauma, right? So you talk about financial trauma, and it would seem that these experiences also feed into that. So if you could explain first, what is financial trauma like, and how do we end up there, and what is its impact on us as adults?
Yeah, I love that question because they do intertwine, right? When I think about how financial trauma can impact your willingness to stay in an environment that you're being abused, right? Whether that is a domestic environment, whether that is a working environment, or any environment, really, there's there's a reason for that. And I grew up, and I talk about this, or I used to talk about this quite a lot. I grew up experiencing aspects of poverty. So for me, a big driving motivator, especially in corporate spaces and working environments, was to position myself as far away from poverty as possible. So I need to be making the most money that I could make, chasing the promotions as fast as I can get them, so that I can have more money, so that I can either put more money away, invest it, whatever, pushing that poverty potential far away. What I didn't realize at the time, because of the trauma, was that poverty is a mindset, right? And so operating in scarcity says I need to get as much as I can because if I don't have it, somebody else will. So to answer your question, and financial trauma is defined in a lot of different ways, but I define it as any instance, either observed or experienced, that has a negative impact on the way that you view money, what you believe about money, or how you interact with money. I believe that everybody experiences financial trauma at some point or another because there's so much information out there relating to how you manage money or how you should be managing your money. And that misinformation or accurate information received at the wrong time can have a negative impact on how you then execute on financial strategies, whether that be related to credit, whether that be related to investing. And of course, those situations can have an impact on your willingness to then move forward through those things. So I was having a conversation last night, and this individual that I was talking to had shared with me that they were trading cryptocurrency and that they had to really kind of check themselves when the crash happened because they were like, I lost so much money, right? And they're like, I'm a walking debt right now. And I'm like, oof, you know, but I think over the last couple of years with social media, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on the cryptocurrencies and the meme stocks and actual stocks that have value, but are hyperinflated based off of their popularity on social media. And people are getting into these markets without really understanding what it is that they're getting into with money that they need and then getting burned in the experience, which can have a negative impact in the future on their willingness to invest, period. But they never had the right foundational information. They were just told, invest, right? Or they heard a soundbite that said, invest. And so they went and they followed that advice. So I think that that's a really good example of how trauma can impact us in the early stages of our knowledge on managing personal finances. But I've seen over my banking career, I've seen many situations occur, simple and complex, relating to the loss of life and how do you, as the surviving child, spouse, etc., go and assume ownership of the assets that were left behind, divorces, and who gets what after all the fighting is done, inheritance, or people who've always been wealthy, who've always had money, but suddenly they now have to manage their own money and they don't have a middleman or a money manager to tell them what to do. So now they're like, well, how do I handle this wealth? So I think when we hear terms like financial education or we hear terms like financial trauma, that we automatically box off the people who have money or who have had experience with wealth as being ineligible or not needing education on these topics, when really they are just as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable than we are, because they have not had time in that space.
So let me ask you this. So one of the things I talk about, excuse me, are the money scripts that we have running in our heads that kind of impact our relationship with money as adults. So for example, you're a kid, you go to the store, you get to talk before you go in. All right, when you go in, don't take none, don't touch none, put your hand on, don't break none, because I ain't, we get that. And then the way we approach going to the store is, okay, most of the stuff I can't have, there's always a lack of money. We don't have enough. I can't have what I want. But then as you move into adulthood, right? Many people, like I said, even if you have a skill set that has allowed you to earn, whether, that's whatever it is, right? You might be a scientist, you might be an athlete or an entertainer, whatever it is, but still, our relationship with money hasn't been healed. Because I remember you had a post once and you said, when I ask people to describe their relationship with money, people will often say, "Oh yeah, I can, I'm good at saving or balancing or whatever." And you said, "But that's not your relationship, right?
Right.
That is a function, but that's not the relationship." So, can you help people understand how your beliefs and values and thoughts around money are very different from the functional tasks that we perform with money?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. So that was an exercise that I did with a group. It was a low income group actually, and I kind of knew the lay of the land right before I delivered this presentation. And to your point, that was the feedback. Either I have a problem with overspending, or I understand how to save, or I understand how to budget. So I would say I'm pretty good at it. And my rebuttal was, well, yeah, you're talking about money management, but you're not talking about your relationship with money. And so when I ask that question, what I'm really asking is, does money make you anxious? Right? Does money make you fearful? Does talking about these topics have a negative response? Is talking about money a negative trigger? And if that is the case, well, let's explore why. And I love the analogy that you use, or really not the analogy, but the reality that you articulated when it comes to us as children going into stores and being told, don't touch anything, don't ask for anything, I can't afford this thing, or even like the really popular, do you have McDonald's money, right? And building on that, as adults, what happens is because we were conditioned to not have, when we get to a place where we can have, it's going to go one or two ways, right? We're going to maintain that same kind of modality and saying, well, I don't have enough, so I can't have that. Or I have to constantly buy like the cheapest thing, or, shop the deals or the name brand or whatever. Or we go off the rails in the other direction and say, well, now I can afford it, and I'm going to buy the most expensive version of everything that I can because I can afford it. And so that's not a function of money management necessarily, because if your income can support those purchases, then it's not deviating from the way that you overall manage your picture, right? You can budget for the expensive items, but are you making those choices because you're looking for quality in the purchase of those items, or are you making that decision because now you can, right? And so the power to do something doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be exercised. And in that, um, I think I know a lot of people who do kind of err on that side, the side of lavish luxury, are doing so as a trauma response. And a lot of times they don't have the money management, what I'm speaking of specifically is like the budgeting in place to say, okay, I have done X, Y, Z. I've paid myself first. I've invested. I've done, like, these are the priorities that I've taken care of. Now I have a little bit of play money. I can kind of do whatever it is that I want to.
Right.
And what's challenging, I think, as a financial educator, and certainly somebody who's exploring the space of financial behavior, is that there's no one size fits all approach, right? So advising people on how they should be managing their money.
Right.
So I can't go to you and say, well, yeah, you went and bought the comforter set that costs 2 times the amount of this comforter set, where they are functioning in the same way, right? But one is obviously more comfortable, or there's better quality associated with that. And if it's not having a negative impact on their ability to do other things, then maybe it's a good purchase. But if it is having a negative impact on their ability to do other things, well, then maybe it's not a good purchase. I saw somebody tweet yesterday, if you have a pair of shoes that are more expensive than your bed, than your mattress, right? You're doing it wrong. And I thought that was just so hilarious. But it speaks to a reality that we're talking about, right? People will value certain things, whether that be an article of clothing, whether that be a food item, whether that be jewelry, whether whether that be a car, over things that are arguably not so arguably necessary
Right.
or more of a priority. And one of the and I'm preparing to speak on a panel for a conference next month, and we're talking about removing privilege and shame through the articulation as a financial educator to our audiences and saying, hey, you have to be conscious too of how you impact people that are listening. And so you don't want to judge people for the decisions that they make, but you want to present them with information so that they can make informed decisions. But at the end of the day, somebody who's navigating a financial trauma or a lack of financial know-how is going to make a decision based off of what you say, regardless of how careful you are in crafting that response. And so it's an interesting space that I'm navigating right now because I don't want to be accusatory or judgmental in my delivery of saying, hey, you shouldn't be out there buying a $250 pair of Jordans when, you could buy a couple of shares of Apple because, maybe that's not where they're at. But helping people to understand the value of purchasing an asset over a liability from a very kind of like high level perspective, I think is a safe space to be in. And understanding why they're opting to buy the flashy thing now versus the delayed gratification associated with buying the asset that can produce income for them in the future is the challenge.
I remember not long after you quit your job, you were on you were being interviewed by someone. I forget who it was, but you spoke to the fact that, and I think this is before the Apple split, that you had X number of shares of Apple, and with the split, you're thinking about grabbing some more shares, but based upon your track record of investing, you didn't have the same financial fear that other people had, even in light of having left your job. So where did you develop that knowledge and skill set? Was that from working in the banking industry? Was that something that you were able to self-educate on, or did you have a coach or a mentor?
I think it was a combination of all of the above. Certainly, I was exposed to products and services related to, financial service stuff, right, through on the job. I worked initially for Bank of America, and the brokerage that I use is with Merrill Lynch. So I had a free relationship with Merrill Lynch as an employee of Bank of America, which made, learning the interface and all that stuff very comfortable for me. And then after leaving Bank of America, and even up until this day, I've maintained my brokerage with Merrill Lynch because it's just where my money's always been. But in that experience, of course, you get hands-on the job insights to not only how you manage your money, but how other people manage their money. So I would see people came in with accounts with Merrill and what the status of their combined balances afforded them by way of privilege in the bank because of the relationship. And I'm not like a product evangelist that says, okay, I have Merrill, so you need to go out and have Merrill, right? Like I have Fidelity, I have TD Ameritrade, I have I think those, well, I have, like the Robin Hoods and stuff like that, but my brokerages are kind of spread out. I just opt for, a majority of my money is with Merrill. So there was definitely an on the job component, but I wasn't licensed. I didn't get licensed. I wasn't interested in getting licensed. And so understanding kind of the ins and outs of how to make these decisions, why to make these decisions, how to weather the change in economic cycles, that was very much trial and error and experience based. There was some independent education done through reading, watching videos, attending seminars that helped me to understand, at least on a very high level, that markets do indeed cycle. And so the mistake that most people make is selling at the bottom of the market or trying to time what is the top.
Mhm.
And so for me, I'm a very lazy investor. And what I mean by that is just buy and hold, right? That makes the most sense for me. I don't have the anxiety of trying to chase the highs and the lows or looking every single day at, what's what. It's just buy, buy, buy. And I've been buying and holding Apple, I think, since 2013, 2014. So, the company has grown quite a bit over that time period. And I've just been very committed to, doubling down on my positions with Apple because I believe in the company. I mean, I use all of their products for the most part. And, that gives me greater satisfaction in the purchasing of their products because I know that I'm a shareholder.
Right.
Um, as far as mentorship goes, I wouldn't say that I've had somebody to like take me by the hand and say, okay, Rakim, like you should do this, you shouldn't do this. This is what, life could look like for you if you do this. But, I think it's important to define mentorship, right? And so, who do you consider a mentor? Do you consider, somebody that you can see and touch and talk to as a mentor, or do you consider this book that you pick up or this video that you watch or this conference that you attend? Do you consider the person delivering that information a mentor, and how do you follow their content? And I know that that's kind of a slippery slope with social media's push around the 30-second to 60-second sound bites, right? Because you can get a sound bite that's 60 seconds and take it out of context if you don't have the whole hour-long conversation that was being had around it. And that's happened. You know, big fan of Grant Cardone. I like, what he talks about. I like his attitude around investing and sales and, just the passion that he has around a lot of the work that he does. But my first exposure to Grant Cardone was a 60-second soundbite that said, buying a house to live in is a bad investment. And I was like, what? And I had just bought a house at the time. And I'm like, what is he talking about?
Right.
And I was like, oh, this guy is just like super popular, has all these followers, and he's giving out this misinformation from a place of privilege as a white man who has all the opportunity in the world, where black home ownership has been on the decline, and it is the fastest way to build wealth through real estate. And so I just thought that was irresponsible. But then I realized how social media works, right? Of course, it's supposed to be controversial so that people can listen and talk about it.
Right.
He's marketing. And so I share that to say that even if somebody listening to me for mentorship unofficially, that follow this person's journey, follow their track record and the consistency in the messaging that they deliver, get the whole story, and let that be your guide as a mentor, instead of looking at the 60-second or the 30-second soundbite and saying, oh, okay, that's what he said, that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
Regardless of if they have the blue check or not, or, if they have 100,000 followers, you know what I'm saying? Like, don't let the credibility associated with other people's validation impact your ability to extract valuable information that's going to be potentially life-changing for you. Got to do your own due diligence.
Right. Okay. That's a good point. And actually, something that I've been thinking about is this, right? So when you're talking about mentorship and who you're learning from, when it comes to financial education, for example, two huge figures in that space are Kiyosaki and Ramsey, right? Robert Kiyosaki and Dave Ramsey. Now, I've, in my circle of, family and friends, I've cautioned people about getting too deep into them because of what you just mentioned, right? So the place that they're speaking from, they don't have the same experiences that we have, haven't come from, depending on how much of Rich Dad Poor Dad you believe, haven't had the same experiences with financial trauma that we have had in our neighborhoods and in our families generationally. So, you might get some strategies that might be effective, but on the whole, I caution people against taking everything from them. How do you think it makes the most sense for us to determine whether we should be listening to someone and taking their advice, and then how much of that to take on board?
I like this question. So I'm sure you've seen, and others have seen, I have this kind of push-pull relationship with Kiyosaki in particular's content and Ramsey's content as a whole, because of the way that people, and Black people specifically, evangelize and patronize their work. And to your point, I don't believe that the work that they have done or the work that they're doing in terms of content created was created with Black men and women in mind, or created from a place of understanding or acknowledgement to the struggles that are systemic, racial, etc., that we experience and have experienced in this country. That said, I think it's very important to kind of take their content with a grain of salt, right? I love Dave Ramsey's That Snowball, right? That's the thing that he's famous for. And there are a lot that has helped a lot of people get out of debt. It's a good strategy. And to be honest, I don't know that it's something that he necessarily created or if it's just something that he popularized. But, when you hear the Debt Snowball, you think of Dave Ramsey and his baby steps, right? Robert Kiyosaki talks about the cash flow quadrant. And again, I don't know that that's something that he necessarily created, but he certainly coined it. And when people talk about the cash flow quadrant, they think about Robert Kiyosaki.
Right.
So I think that those things are impactful, useful things to reference in the delivery of content. Certainly reading the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad opened my eyes up to entrepreneurship, business ownership, investing in a very different way than I understood it. And I was in my early 20s when I was exposed to his content. That, of course, has had a ripple effect on me today. That said, I think people have a hard time separating the person from their work. And, to even get a little bit more specific, people have a hard time separating a person's views from their work. And so how do you extract someone's genius or innovation from their disposition towards you or somebody that looks like you, right? And so I don't know what Robert Kiyosaki's personal feelings as it relates to Black people in this country are, other than what he's articulated on Twitter. Same thing with Dave Ramsey. But I do know, to your point, that their experiences are very different than what our experiences would have been or have been. And therefore, there's a level of understanding that they cannot have other than academic understanding, right? If they wanted to take the time, energy, and effort and doing the research to understand how these things have impacted us. But I see on the other side of that, so many people arguing, and I used to be one of them, so many people arguing or promoting their book, right? I used to go and say, hey, go read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. That book changed my life. I never really read Dave Ramsey's book, so I never promoted it. But I know that Dave Ramsey's work is circulating in Black churches. So, I mean, there's a level of popularity there that's just kind of unmatched.
Right.
And that's really the reason why I decided to write my book, because I was like, you know what, I can extract the pieces of information that I've learned from them tied into my own experience while talking about my experience and how those things impact the way that I move financially and the way that I've moved financially. In that, when we're talking about concepts that most traditionalists in the financial education space stand behind firmly, I can kind of shake things up and talk about how, well, maybe it's not necessary to have an emergency fund of 6 months to a year, because maybe it's necessary for us to do it a different way, right? And so I talk about my story. When I went to go buy my house, I was 26 years old, and I did not have the backing financially of my family. And it's not because they didn't want to, it's because they didn't have it, right? So, I was the one that people were coming to asking for money, not the other way around. And so my big fear going into buying my house was, well, what happens if I need a new roof, which I did? What happens if the water heater goes, which it did? What happens if I need to buy a new furnace, which, knock on wood, I won't need to worry about, at least in the immediate future. How am I going to pay for these things? And those what ifs almost deterred me from making the purchase. And so you talk about financial trauma, like there is that preemptive trauma associated with anxiety of how can I get out of this situation? Or am I making enough money to maintain the mortgage? And those are not things that Dave Ramsey talks about. Those are not things that Robert Kiyosaki talks about. The 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 wealth gap that exists, and I want to be clear too in saying the wealth gap that intentionally exists, as Black people in this country have been robbed of wealth multiple times over. Um, it's not an accident. And so when we talk about going out and buying the multifamily house and repeating this process over and over, yeah, certainly it's something that can be done, but it's also something that comes with more apprehension because of the painful history that a lot of our families have navigated, or the income disparities that a lot of our peers and families do navigate. And so my situation, I couldn't have an emergency fund fast enough to account for what it was that I was buying because I didn't know what I was buying. So my strategy involved getting access to a lot of credit very quickly. And so then I had maintained this idea that, well, I don't need an emergency fund because if an emergency comes up, I'll just put it on credit. And that will give me the leeway that I need to then liquidate what it is that I need to liquidate from an asset perspective and pay it off. And I've had that conversation with other people in the personal finance space, and they're like, what? No emergency fund? Credit over leveraging? Like it's like shocking to them. But it's a strategy that I had to use out of I won't say survival, but just thinking outside of the box so that I could acquire, this asset. And so there's a million of these scenarios that we can talk about. And this can branch off into so many different conversations as, I see things on social media and in the news even about, reparations bills. And I saw somebody, and I kind of laughed at it, even though it's not funny. I saw somebody tweet, what's happened with the PPP loans tells us exactly what's going to happen if reparations is given. And I was like, damn, like that's like that's a gut punch, but
Yeah.
there's some reality to that because you see a lot of the people who fraudulently taken out these PPP loans went out and went on vacation and bought these liabilities, and they don't have anything to show for it. And now with Biden, doubling down on investigations relating to that PPP fraud, I'm very concerned about what that's going to look like in the coming years,
Right.
for Black people in particular, who've participated in that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you mentioned Kiyosaki's cash flow quadrant and Ramsey snowball. If you were going to just share with us your top 3 tips that you could give to our people for working to improve their financial situation, like what are your top 3 tips?
So I love this question too. Kiyosaki has the cash flow quadrant, Ramsey has the snowball, I have the 3 E's, and that is exposure, education, execution. And usually I give that the 3 E's as a response to the question, well, how do we overcome financial trauma? And so 3 E's really that's the process that I followed. Exposure says, okay, this thing is possible, right? I can see somebody else did it. Now I know that it can be done. Education is understanding what steps are necessary to take in order to make that thing happen. So in my case, we'll talk about credit and real estate. I had a friend who was a couple years older than me who had an 800 credit score, and I'm like, I didn't even know that credit went that high. I want an 800 credit score. Same friend had owned a multifamily property before they were 30. I said, well, I want to own multifamily property before I'm 30. And so the follow up to that was understanding what it took to get to that point. So how do I build my credit and how do I buy a home? And coincidentally, not coincidentally, those things are tied into each other, right? You got to have good credit to get the loan. And then the execution, which is arguably the hardest part, because there are a lot of people who are exposed, there are a lot of people who are educated, but when it comes to overcoming the what ifs that I shared earlier, right? The traumas that make you kind of stop in your track or second guess or procrastinate on pulling the trigger. That's where the execution comes in. And sometimes people can get over that on their own. I have a wonderful support system. I've always had a wonderful support system who just always believed in Rakim, right? They always, if Rakim wants to do it, it can be done. If anybody could do it, Rakim could do it. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And so the reinforcement from my community and also my own internal confidence helped me kind of get over a lot of those fears, just face those fears and use fear as an ally. But that won't be the case for everybody. And so I would say that's where the value of mentors, coaches, um, people who've done it before come in and can hold your hand through the process. And that's why I think the work that we do is so important because you're showing people not only the education, not only telling them your story and what it is that you've been able to accomplish, but being able to help them kind of walk across that barrier of really fear is what it is, or trauma to accomplish and execute on that thing. So I'll say, my thing is the 3 E's for sure.
Okay. I like that. You're gonna have to use that.
Yeah, definitely.
um, from the outside looking in, it really seems like you're on a mission. So, a very simple question to you is, what is your mission and what do you want your legacy to be?
So the first thing that comes to my mind is empowerment. My mission is to empower people in general, but specifically people that look like me. To and I use this phrase in my book, believe in the impossibility of impossibility.
Ah,
And really that's just saying that there's no limit to what you can accomplish, right? We create these walls and these structures around why we can't do a thing. And that is the limitation, right? Ourselves. So that's not to ignore the barriers that exist or pretend that, you know, there isn't privilege in the world that makes some of these things easier for other people. It's to say that we recognize that these barriers exist and we find a way to navigate around them and make that thing happen. And I think that the biggest barrier that exists is within our minds. And so going back to our earlier point about this idea of poverty and scarcity, right? You can be making 6 figures, 7 figures, become a millionaire, become a multimillionaire. We see it all the time with athletes and entertainers,
right.
and turn around and they lose all of it,
Mhm.
or a majority of it, because of their mindset. And so, how do we align ourselves spiritually, mentally, and then physically in this world, right? To be um, in control of our destinies whether that be financial or otherwise. And I think that that's what I want my legacy to be. Somebody who came in, shook things up, got people to start thinking and believing in themselves. And then they all did it, right? I want people to say, I heard Rakim speak, or I read something that Rakim wrote, and because of that, I was able to do this. And whatever this is, I want it to be a great thing, right? Somebody goes and finds a secret to recreating the pyramids because of something that Rakim said, that would be a wonderful accomplishment for me.
Awesome. Love that. And again, like I said when we started, um, actually following your content inspired me to go get certified. I was curious about why. So for example, I started my first business when I was 8, right? Long story short, I ended up selling Girl Scout cookies, but I worked out like this whole scheme for distribution in different schools. And, I took a $100 loan from my aunt. And over the spring Girl Scout cookie season, after paying her back, buying the cookies, paying my distributors, I still pocketed almost $2,000. And in 3 months, it was all gone. I couldn't figure out why. Like, I thought I was rich. I would never have to work a day in my life. I was 8. And since then, right, I've always had this cycle of making lots of money and then not having a dollar. And I'm like, what is going on? So I realized that I needed to kind of figure this thing out, because what happens for many of us, when you know you can earn, you don't take your relationship with money as seriously as you should, to really peel back the layers and uncover the trauma and work out those relationships so that you can be healthy. You don't pass down negative behaviors to subsequent generations. But I knew that I needed more tools, and I had to start to understand financial psychology. So the exposure to you and your content did that for me. So I got the CFEI, I got another one. And, as I started to think about this, I'm like, wow, had I not had that exposure from you, someone who looks like me, who's from, the same part of the country, and you can relate to these things, so that when you're giving it to me, it resonates. It's not academic. It's not something esoterical that, yeah, it sounds good on paper, but realistically, how is that going to relate to my life? And you don't know what it's like to be on food stamps, but I do. So how is that going to work for me? I didn't have that to worry about. So, like, one of the reasons, like, whenever I see your content, I'm like, yo, Rakim said it. And like when you had the hashtag Rakim said it, yeah, that's the impact that we need to have. You know what I mean? So I think you're well on your way to creating that legacy, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard or been in a conversation with someone who said something that I know the answer that they're looking for is something that you've been teaching. So it's going to multiply exponentially over time. It's kind of like, your early investment in Apple, right? And the growth of that over time. So in any event, out of respect for your time, I'm not going to keep you any longer. But if people want to work with you, how can they work with you? How can they connect with you? Are you offering group coaching or one-to-one mentoring? What can people do to work with you to improve their financial situation?
Yeah, so I'm very responsive on social media and through my website, and everything is my name. So my website, rakimsabree.com. Social media is all at Rakim Sabree. No dots, no underscores, because there's a lot of fakes out there now. It's just at Rakim Sabree. And I mean, right now I'm getting ready to go into conference season. So next month I'm going to a conference. The month after that, I'm going to a conference. So I don't know that I have the capacity to work with anybody right now. But that said, I know definitely at the turn of the year, I'll have a lot of time. And those conversations can start today. If somebody's interested in working with me and they slide in my DM or they send me an email and like, hey, let's work, then we would talk about, when time is going to slow down for me and we can get started. But that's the easiest way. Like I said, very down to earth person, very accessible, at least in the current environment, right? Who knows how long that will last. But DMs, emails work serious inquiries only, and I'm happy to help out.
Okay. And in the meantime, if people want to get your book, how can they do that?
The book is available on Amazon.
All right. All right. And it's Financially Irresponsible. You can search them by author name or by title. You'll find it there. A great read, well worth the investment. Well, we'll wrap up. This has been Stairway to Seven, because you got to take the elevator. You can't take the elevator to the section that you got to take the stairs. And six figures ain't what it used to be. We got to change the conversation, start working towards making seven figures. I've been Ismail Abdurrahman. This has been Rakim Sabree. Follow him on social media. Everything is at his name, no dots, no underscores. Watch out for those fake accounts. Only follow the checks. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure connecting with you like this. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And I'm sure this is going to be a great benefit for our audience.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.